New York shone like a beacon of promises in the dark night, its lights reflecting off skyscrapers that formed a titanic barrier against the sky. At the epicenter of this metropolis, where dreams were made and undone with equal ease, Alexander Wells stood as the undisputed king. His life was a testament to power, prestige, and a wealth so vast it was almost incalculable. For many, his name was synonymous with success and the realization of the American dream. From his luxurious penthouse atop one of Manhattan's tallest buildings, Alexander had a privileged view of the world he had helped shape. From his glass-walled office, he could see the pulse of the city that never slept, a city that, in many ways, responded to his whims. He was a man who had climbed from the lowest rung, from extreme poverty, to reach the pinnacle of society. His face had appeared on countless magazine covers, his speeches were studied by aspiring magnates, and his counsel was sought by presidents and world leaders. Everything he touched turned to gold. But what no one knew was that the brilliance of his success concealed deep shadows, a past that Alexander had done everything in his power to bury. However, as often happens with the darkest secrets, this one was about to resurface and demand its due. It was a rainy afternoon in New York, with gray clouds covering the sky and a persistent drizzle bathing the city. Alexander had just returned from a meeting with international investors. It had been another successful encounter, just one more in a long list of achievements that seemed to confirm his untouchable position in the business world. He was in a good mood as he headed to his personal office, a spacious room decorated with contemporary art and a collection of books that reflected his endless curiosity about history and philosophy. As he settled into his leather chair, his personal assistant, a young and efficient man, entered the office carrying a small silver tray. On it rested a single white envelope. "This arrived by courier a few minutes ago, Mr. Wells," he said professionally, handing over the envelope with a slight nod. Alexander raised an eyebrow. It was unusual for him to receive personal correspondence, and even more so without it being filtered by his security team. He took the envelope and noticed it had no return address. It was completely blank, with no markings except for his name written in capital letters on the front. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. Without giving it much thought, he broke the seal and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. As he unfolded it, his eyes locked onto the few words it contained. "I know what you did, and everything will come to light." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. It was a visceral, instantaneous reaction. Throughout his life, he had learned to maintain composure in any situation, but those few words had caught him off guard. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and read the message again, as if a second reading might change what he already knew. The words seemed to dance on the page, each one heavy with a weight he couldn't ignore. There was no signature, no obvious clues about the sender, but what was clear was that someone knew a secret Alexander had guarded jealously for decades. A secret that, if revealed, could unravel everything he had built. He placed the letter in a drawer of his desk, locking it securely. His mind, usually quick and calculating, was tangled in a chaotic web of thoughts. Who could have sent that letter? How deep was the knowledge this person had of his past? And most importantly, what did they want? Alexander had always been a man of action, and although this situation disturbed him, he was not about to let it control him. He immediately called for his assistant. "I want you to find out everything you can about this letter. Trace the courier, check the security cameras, talk to whoever is necessary. I want to know who sent it and how it got to me," he ordered with a tone that left no room for doubt. The assistant nodded and left the office, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts. The rain softly pattered against the windows, and the constant noise of New York traffic seemed distant, like a murmur lost in the background. But inside Alexander, the noise was deafening. Something he had buried deep was beginning to awaken. The first time Alexander found himself in a desperate situation was many years ago, when he was still a young man with nothing but his ambition and will to survive. Growing up on the toughest streets of New York had taught him lessons he would never forget. At a young age, he understood that the world was not a fair place, and if he wanted something, he would have to take it, no matter the cost. The letter had opened a door he had long ago locked. Memories flooded back like an uncontrollable torrent, images and sensations that transported him to those dark days. He remembered the cold of nights when he had nowhere to sleep, the hunger that twisted him inside, and the desperation that drove him to do things he was not proud of. One name echoed in his mind, a name he hadn't spoken in a long time: Elliot Marston. Elliot had been more than just an acquaintance. He had been a mentor in Alexander's early criminal life, a charismatic and dangerous man who taught him what was necessary to survive and thrive in a world where the weak were devoured. Elliot had offered Alexander the first great opportunity of his life, but that opportunity came at a price. It was a dark deal, one involving betrayal and violence. Alexander accepted it, fully aware of what it meant. That was the first step on the path that would lead him to power, but it was also the first brick in the construction of the cage he now found himself trapped in. The exact details of what happened between Elliot and Alexander blurred in his memory, as if his mind had tried to protect him from the ugliest aspects of his past. What he did remember clearly was that that deal changed his life forever, and not necessarily for the better. He had left Elliot behind when his success began to take off, cutting all ties with his former mentor and any trace of his past life. Alexander became a new man, one who mingled with the elite and made decisions that affected millions. But although he changed his name and his destiny, he could not change the ghosts that haunted him. The anonymous letter seemed to bring those ghosts into the present, reminding him that the past always has a way of catching up with us, no matter how hard we try to run from it. In the days that followed, Alexander became more reserved, even with his family. Every time he received a message or answered a call, he couldn't help but wonder if the sender or the person on the other end knew more than they let on. Paranoia began to settle into his mind, like a shadow following his every step. He ordered a complete review of the security in his home and offices. All his employees, from the closest to those he barely knew, were subjected to strict evaluations. Security cameras were meticulously reviewed, and anyone who had had access to his office in recent weeks was discreetly questioned. However, nothing unusual was found. The letter had arrived without leaving a trace, as if the sender knew Alexander's every move and how to evade his security measures. Meanwhile, his relationship with his wife and children began to suffer. Although Alexander tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, they noticed his growing distraction. His wife, Sarah, an intelligent and perceptive woman, asked him several times if everything was all right, but he always found a way to avoid the conversation. He couldn't afford to share the burden he carried, not without exposing her to the same dangers he now faced. Nights became tormenting. Alexander, a man who normally slept soundly, now found himself awake for hours, replaying every possible threat in his mind. The bed, which used to be his refuge, now felt like a cell, and the silence of the early morning amplified his fears. He began drinking more than usual, a whiskey here, another there, just to calm his nerves, but even the finest liquor couldn't quell the anxiety consuming him. The paranoia also affected his work. Reports he used to read with ease now seemed like labyrinths of confusing data, and decisions he once made without hesitation turned into endless dilemmas. He began to doubt the people he had trusted for years, suspecting that anyone could be the hand behind the letter. Even his closest partners noticed something was wrong, though no one dared to ask him directly. The letter had planted a seed of doubt in Alexander's heart, and that doubt was growing, threatening to destroy everything he had built. But what terrified him most was the possibility that his secret would come to light, not because of the damage it could do to him, but because of what it would mean for his family. He had worked his entire life to protect them, to ensure them a future free of the hardships he had faced, and now all of that was at risk. One night, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Alexander decided it was time to confront his past directly. He knew that the only way to stop his enemy was to understand who was behind the letter and why. After all these years, they had decided to strike. He returned to his office, this time with a bottle of whiskey in hand. He sat down in his chair and opened his computer, accessing a file he had kept hidden even from his closest collaborators. The file contained information on Elliot Marston, his former mentor and, in many ways, his first enemy. Elliot was a man with whom Alexander had cut all contact decades ago, after his first major success. He had heard rumors that Elliot had continued with his shady dealings, but he had never bothered to check. It had been so long since he left that life behind that Alexander had almost convinced himself that Elliot was just a figure in a forgotten chapter of his story. However, as he reviewed the reports and notes he had collected in that file, he realized that Elliot had never forgotten him. There were notes on meetings, operations, and people Elliot had worked with. There was even a recent photograph of Elliot, in which he looked older, but with the same intense gaze that Alexander remembered. Alexander spent hours going over every detail, every clue that could give him an edge over his enemy. He couldn't allow Elliot or whoever was behind this threat to take away what he had achieved. He was willing to do whatever it took to protect his empire and his family. By the end of the night, Alexander made a decision. If Elliot Marston had returned, he too had to return to his roots, to that dark place within himself where he had buried the desperate young man he once was. He had to be as ruthless as he had been then because the game had changed and survival was at stake. And Alexander Wells had never been a man who played to lose. The next morning brought with it a sense of unease that Alexander couldn't shake. New York, with its incessant noise and activity, felt strangely distant, as if an invisible barrier separated him from the world he had known and controlled so well. Since receiving the anonymous letter, something had changed inside him. For the first time in years, he felt the walls of his impeccable empire closing in around him. The letter, which he had read so many times that its words were etched in his mind, was the first indication that something was terribly wrong. But what disturbed him the most was the precision of the message. "I know what you did, and everything will come to light." Whoever had sent it not only knew his past, but was willing to expose it. Alexander decided to act cautiously. He knew that the key to resolving this situation was to keep a cool head and make sure no one suspected that something was affecting him. He ordered his assistant to cancel all non-essential meetings while he prepared to investigate on his own. He knew that if he showed any sign of weakness, his enemies, whoever they were, would seize the opportunity to strike. In the solitude of his office, he began mentally reviewing a list of possible suspects. His mind, sharp and accustomed to thinking several steps ahead, first focused on those who knew his darkest secrets. Some of these secrets dated back to the early days of his rise to power when the decisions he made were the ones that defined the course of his life. Alexander felt trapped between the man he was now and the power-hungry young man he once was. He decided to contact Julian Stark, a man who moved in the shadows of the financial world with the same skill as a predator stalking its prey. Stark had the ability to uncover hidden information, to unearth the darkest secrets of anyone. "Julian, I need you to find someone for me," Alexander said with a coldness that barely masked his concern. Darren Blake. Darren Blake, a former partner with whom Alexander had severed ties years ago, had been a key player in his rise, but also a man who harbored grudges. Blake knew enough about Alexander to pose a threat, especially if someone had convinced him to use that knowledge against him. Julian Stark accepted the assignment without asking questions, something Alexander deeply valued in him. He knew Stark wouldn't rest until he found Blake, if he was even alive. But Alexander couldn't afford to wait passively for results. He had to prepare for any eventuality, and that meant facing the specter he had tried to bury for so long, Elliot Marston. Elliot Marston was a name that evoked a mix of admiration and fear in Alexander's mind. More than a decade ago, Elliot had been his mentor, a man who taught him the rules of the game in a world where morality was just a facade the weak used to justify their failure. Elliot had guided him in the early steps toward power, but had also dragged him into a darkness from which Alexander had been trying to escape ever since. He remembered the days when he worked side by side with Elliot, negotiating deals that seemed impossible and removing obstacles with a coldness that often left him restless at night. But over time, Alexander realized that the path Elliot had put him on was unsustainable. There came a point when he knew he would have to betray his mentor in order to survive and thrive on his own. That betrayal was a turning point. It allowed Alexander to leave his past life behind and become the magnate he was today, but it also left an open wound that never fully healed. It was said that Elliot had died in a car accident somewhere in Eastern Europe, but the appearance of the anonymous letter made him question everything. Alexander knew that, to face this new threat, he would have to confront his past once and for all. He decided to contact Maggie Hale, an old associate of Elliot's and someone Alexander knew still had ties to the darker parts of the world he had once lived in. Maggie was as cunning as she was dangerous, and if anyone had information about Elliot, it was her. The meeting was arranged at a private club, a place where New York's elite could discuss sensitive matters away from prying eyes. When Alexander arrived, he found Maggie waiting for him in a private room, her inquisitive gaze fixed on him. "Alexander," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "it's rare for you to call me after all this time. What brings you here?" "I need to know if Elliot Marston is alive," Alexander said bluntly. He had no time for pleasantries. Maggie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge how much he really knew. Finally, she sighed and leaned in closer. "There are rumors, Alexander. Nothing confirmed, but some say Elliot didn't die in that accident, that he faked his death to get off the radar and continue his work in the shadows." That revelation, though vague, was enough to make Alexander feel a knot in his stomach. "And what work would that be?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Some say he joined the Black Hand," Maggie replied in a hushed tone, as if she feared someone might overhear. "An organization everyone's heard of, but no one knows much about. If Elliot is alive and involved with them, it's not something you can ignore." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. The possibility that Elliot was linked to the Black Hand changed everything. He knew that this organization was more than just a rumor. It was a clandestine network of powerful individuals operating in the shadows, manipulating global events for their own ends. If Elliot was with them, Alexander was in much greater danger than he had imagined. As Alexander processed the information, he received a call from Julian Stark. His tone was unusually tense. "Alexander, I have news. I found Darren Blake, but not in the way you expected." Alexander gripped the phone tightly. "What do you mean?" "Darren Blake died 3 years ago in a plane crash," Stark replied gravely. "But before he died, he transferred a large sum of money to an account in Switzerland. That account is linked to an organization called the Black Hand." The words fell like a hammer in Alexander's mind. The Black Hand, the organization Maggie had mentioned, the secret network that could be behind everything. "Are you sure about this, Julian?" "As sure as anyone can be," Stark said. "But that's not the worst of it. There are signs that someone has been moving money from that account recently, and it doesn't seem to be Blake. If someone else has taken his place, they could be very close to you, Alexander." Alexander's mind raced. Who was behind these movements? Who had taken control of Blake's account? And more importantly, what was their ultimate goal? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there were still too many blanks. He knew he was facing something much bigger than a simple reckoning from the past. The idea that the Black Hand was involved was terrifying. This organization didn't operate on mere grudges. They moved with precision and purpose, making them almost impossible to stop. If Alexander was their target, they wouldn't stop until they destroyed everything he had built. And if Elliot Marston was behind it all, then he knew he was dealing with someone who not only knew him but had shaped him in many ways. As Alexander delved deeper into the investigation, the tension within him intensified. Each new discovery brought him closer to the edge of the abyss, and his ability to maintain control wavered. His thoughts constantly returned to his family. Sarah, his wife, and his children were his anchor in the storm he now faced. but they were also his greatest vulnerability. Nights became a nightmare of insomnia. As he sat alone in his office, surrounded by documents and files, Alexander wrestled with his inner demons. He remembered the first time Elliot had taken him on a dirty job, as he called it. The target had been a competitor who stood in the way of their plans. Elliot's lesson had been clear. In this world, Alexander, you either eat or get eaten. There's no middle ground. That was the first time Alexander crossed a line from which he could never return. Since then, he had perfected the art of manipulation and removing obstacles, but now he was facing an enemy who seemed to have learned from his own methods. And that terrified him. The internal conflict intensified every time he looked into Sarah's eyes. He knew he couldn't allow his family to pay the price for his past decisions, but at the same time, he understood that there was no turning back. If he didn't act, if he didn't take drastic measures, everything he had built would crumble. But at what cost? Alexander found himself at a point of no return. He felt the darkness within him, that part of his soul he had learned to suppress, beginning to resurface. He knew that to face the Black Hand, and possibly Elliot, he would have to become the man he once was again. A man who didn't hesitate to sacrifice everything for power. But this time, the sacrifice could be much higher. The pressure in Alexander's mind reached a critical point when he received a call from Maggie. Her voice, usually composed, carried a rare tone of concern. "Alexander, we need to meet. I've found something, and it's not good." They arranged to meet at an abandoned warehouse, a place they had used in the past for clandestine meetings. Alexander arrived first, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. When Maggie appeared, she wasn't alone. 2 men, her usual bodyguards, accompanied her, which only heightened the tension. "What did you find?" Alexander asked, wasting no time on pleasantries. Maggie handed him an envelope. "This is what I know. Elliot might be alive, but someone else is pulling the strings. Someone who knows both your past and his." Alexander pulled out the photos from the envelope. They were blurry, taken from a distance, but in one of them, a man who could be Elliot was talking to someone else. Alexander felt his heart stop when he recognized the second man in the photo. Robert King, his head of security. The impact of the revelation was devastating. Robert King, the man he had trusted to protect him, the man who had been his loyal shadow for years, was conspiring with his enemies. Alexander felt as if the ground was slipping out from under him. How long had King been working against him? How much did he know? "Robert King," he murmured, feeling the betrayal cut like a knife. "This changes everything." Maggie nodded, fully aware of the implications. If King is involved, it means the enemy is closer than you thought. You can't trust anyone, Alexander. Alexander felt a mixture of anger and despair. He was trapped in a web of betrayals and lies, and now, the one person he had relied on to protect his life turned out to be the greatest danger. He didn't have time to hesitate. He knew he had to act fast before King, or whoever was behind him, made their move. Back in his penthouse, Alexander sat in his office, his mind boiling with plans and strategies. He knew he had to eliminate Robert King, but doing so without alerting the rest of the Black Hand would be nearly impossible. He was playing a dangerous game, one where any mistake could cost him his life. As he reviewed his options, he received a text message. It was short, just one sentence, but its meaning left him paralyzed. "Your wife and children are in danger. Move fast, or you'll lose them." Alexander felt the world close in on him. The Black Hand had made their move. This was no longer just about him. It was about his family. He knew he had to act immediately, but every decision brought him closer to the edge of the abyss. He was about to lose everything unless he found a way to turn the tide. Time was running out, and Alexander knew he couldn't afford a single mistake. The game had changed, and now, more than ever, he had to be more ruthless, more intelligent, and faster than his enemies. But could he save his family without sacrificing everything he had built? The answer to that question would have to wait, but one thing was clear. Alexander's next move would be crucial, and there would be no turning back. Alexander Wells was not a man easily defeated. The betrayal of Robert King and the imminent threat to his family had shaken him to his core, but they had also awakened a steely determination within him. He knew that now, more than ever, every move he made had to be calculated with surgical precision. Time was against him, and the Black Hand would give him no quarter. With the message in his mind, he knew he couldn't afford to waste a second. First, Alexander activated a series of emergency protocols he had established in case he ever found himself in a situation of extreme danger. He knew he couldn't trust anyone else within his immediate circle, but he had contacts outside his organization who were prepared to respond in situations like this. He called an old ally, a man named Sebastian Greer, a former intelligence agent with a vast network of resources and loyalties. Greer had worked on clandestine missions for various governments and knew the darkest corners of the world. If anyone could help protect his family while he confronted the Black Hand, it was Greer. "Sebastian," Alexander said, his voice showing no weakness, "I need your help. My family is in danger, and I need you to get them to safety." Greer didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Where are they now?" he asked, his tone professional and direct. "At home, but not for long. I want you to get them out of the city. Use Protocol Phoenix," Alexander ordered. Protocol Phoenix was a contingency plan he had developed with Greer years ago, a network of safe houses across the country, completely isolated and protected. "Consider it done, Alexander," Greer replied before ending the call. Alexander knew that, at least for the moment, his family would be safe, but that only solved part of the problem. Alexander couldn't simply hide. He knew that the only way to protect his family permanently was to neutralize the threat of the Black Hand and eliminate Robert King, who had turned out to be a key player in the attack against him. The problem was that King knew him well enough to anticipate some of his moves. He had to be craftier, faster, and willing to do whatever it took to survive. While his family was secretly evacuated, Alexander began executing the next phase of his plan. He ordered his assistant to convene an emergency meeting with the top executives of his corporation. He would use this meeting as a smokescreen, a way to make Robert King and any of the Black Hand's spies believe he was preoccupied with internal problems. The meeting was held in a shielded conference room designed to prevent any form of unauthorized surveillance or eavesdropping. Alexander presented himself as the undisputed leader, masking his inner turmoil with a facade of unshakable confidence. As they discussed ongoing projects, he kept a close watch on each of those present, looking for any sign of betrayal or disloyalty. However, everyone seemed entirely focused on business, unaware of the chaos unfolding in the heart of their leader. The real meeting, however, was happening elsewhere. In secret, Alexander had summoned a small group of loyal allies who were not on his company's payroll, people who owed him their loyalty not just for money, but for a sense of personal debt. These men and women had worked with Alexander on operations that were never recorded in any official document, and they knew how to move undetected. Among them was Marcus Lee, a cybersecurity expert who had worked for Alexander for years, protecting his most valuable assets from external threats. There was also Elena Vargas, a former CIA agent who now specialized in private counterterrorism. Alexander entrusted them with his plan to uncover the true identity of the Black Hand and gather the information needed to destroy them. "We need to know everything we can about the Black Hand," Alexander said as they reviewed plans in a secure location, far from any possible surveillance. "Their members, their operations, their motivations. We can't give them any advantage. We know the Black Hand is an organization that operates in the shadows, manipulating events for their own benefit," said Marcus as he worked on his computer, trying to hack into the organization's most hidden systems. "But what we don't know is who's in charge now. The information we have is vague, but I've found some connections to key figures in various industries. We're talking about people who control vast resources, from oil to cutting-edge technology," added Elena, looking at Alexander with a mix of concern and determination. "If we're right, they're not just a group of criminals, but a network of influence that can destabilize governments if they choose. Alexander knew he was up against something bigger than he had ever imagined, but he couldn't afford to back down. He knew that to stop this organization, he would have to use every tool at his disposal, including those he'd prefer not to remember. The preparation culminated in a crucial decision. Alexander had to confront Robert King, but he would do so on his own terms. He knew that King, realizing his betrayal had been discovered, could become even more dangerous. He needed to surprise him, to strike before he could react. Alexander summoned King to his private office under the pretext of discussing urgent security matters. The office, designed to appear as a neutral space, was equipped with hidden security measures that Alexander had installed without anyone else knowing. On the surface, it was a meeting room like any other, but with a single command. Alexander could activate a security system that would lock all exits and communications, leaving King with no way to escape or call for help. When King arrived, Alexander maintained the pretense of concern over a supposed security issue at one of his facilities. While King reviewed documents and proposed solutions, Alexander watched him silently, measuring each of his movements, waiting for the right moment. Finally, when King looked up to make a suggestion, Alexander activated the security system. The doors locked with a metallic sound, and the lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. King looked up, surprised. "What's going on, Alexander?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. "Robert, I know what you're doing," Alexander replied, his voice as cold as steel. "I know you've been working against me, collaborating with the Black Hand." King tried to deny the accusation, but Alexander didn't give him time. "Don't bother lying. I know you've been in contact with Elliot Marston, if he's really alive, or someone using his name. I know you're part of this conspiracy to destroy me." King's face hardened as he realized there was no way out. "You have no idea what you're up against, Alexander," he said with a voice full of resentment. "It's not just the Black Hand. It's much bigger than that. You've been playing a game you don't fully understand." Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved closer to King, close enough for him to feel his breath. "Then enlighten me, Robert. What do they really want? Why are they after me?" King remained silent for a moment, weighing whether he had anything to gain by revealing more information. Finally, he gave in to the pressure. "It's not just about you, Alexander. It's about what you represent. You're one of the last obstacles in their way. The Black Hand isn't just a criminal organization. It's a movement to reconfigure global power. And you, with your empire, are a threat to them." Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't just personal revenge. It was something bigger, something that could change the balance of power in the world. But before he could fully process this revelation, King made an unexpected move. He pulled out a small gun he had hidden in his jacket and pointed it directly at Alexander. "I'm sorry, Alexander, but this is where your story ends," King said with a coldness Alexander hadn't anticipated. But Alexander was prepared. He had anticipated the possibility of a direct attack. With a quick movement, he activated a second security system that cut off the electricity in the room, plunging it into total darkness. At the same time, an odorless gas began to release, designed to incapacitate any intruder. In the darkness, Alexander heard the sound of King falling to the floor, disoriented and weakened by the gas. Alexander, equipped with a special filter in his clothing, approached and disarmed King with ease. As King lay on the floor, struggling to stay conscious, Alexander leaned over him. "I warned you, Robert. You shouldn't have betrayed me." With one last gasp of effort, King tried to speak, but his voice faded as the darkness completely enveloped him. With Robert King neutralized, Alexander knew he had won a small battle, but the war was far from over. The clock was still ticking, and the threat of the Black Hand still hung over him like the sword of Damocles. He needed to act quickly to capitalize on the advantage he had gained. After ensuring that King posed no further danger, Alexander left him in the custody of his most trusted agents. He had plans to extract more information from him once he recovered, but for now, his priority was to uncover the true identity of the Black Hand's leaders and fully understand their intentions. He returned to his secure hideout where Marcus and Elena were already working with the information obtained from King's devices. Marcus had managed to hack into part of the Black Hand's network and had found connections to several key figures in the global economy. Elena, for her part, was analyzing the organization's activity patterns, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. "We've got something," Marcus said as Alexander approached the operations table. "I found a series of fund transfers going back and forth between multiple offshore accounts. They all seem to converge on a single entity, a shell corporation called Arcturus Holdings. The curious thing is that this corporation has ties to people in positions of power around the world." Alexander frowned. "What do we know about Arcturus Holdings?" "It's a front," Elena replied. "But what we've found suggests it's more than just a cover for money laundering. It looks like they're funding destabilization operations in several countries, coups, political assassinations, market manipulation, and it all points to a central group of individuals who call themselves the Council." "The Council?" Alexander repeated, feeling the plot thickening even further. "Yes," Marcus nodded. "They're the ones really behind the Black Hand. Elliot Marston, if he's alive, is probably just an enforcer, a pawn in their larger plans. The Council is who's pulling the strings." Alexander felt a chill as he realized the magnitude of what he was facing. This wasn't just personal revenge. It was an attempt to restructure the world, to create a new order where only a few privileged people held absolute control. "We have to stop them," Alexander said with renewed determination. "If what you're saying is true, if they're behind all of this, then we're not just fighting for my survival, but for something much bigger." Elena nodded. "It won't be easy, but now that we have a name, we can start attacking their operations. We could cut off their funds, expose their movements. But you'll need more allies for this, Alexander. You can't face the Council alone." Alexander knew she was right. It wasn't just his battle, and he couldn't win it alone. He would have to forge alliances with people he had kept at a distance until now. World leaders, former enemies, anyone who would also see the Council as a threat to their own power. "Start moving," he ordered. "I need a list of potential allies, and I want you to reach out to them discreetly. We can't let the Council know we're onto them until it's too late." As his agents began their work, Alexander felt an enormous weight on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for his life, but for the fate of millions. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it also gave him renewed strength. He knew he couldn't fail. Too much was at stake. As Alexander and his team prepared to face the Council, another betrayal began to take shape, one that Alexander didn't see coming. One of his former allies, a man named Richard Hammond, had been secretly contacted by the Council. Hammond, a billionaire with political ambitions, saw an alliance with the Council as an opportunity to expand his own power. Hammond had been a valuable ally to Alexander in the past, helping him with several financial operations that consolidated his empire. But the promise of a place in the New World Order, where he would have even greater control, was too tempting to resist. Thus, Hammond began leaking crucial information about Alexander's plans to the Council, ensuring his place in their inner circle. As Alexander advanced in his plans to confront the organization, Hammond kept them informed, ensuring that the Council was always one step ahead. Hammond's betrayal wasn't revealed until it was almost too late. During a meeting with potential international allies, one of them received an encrypted message that had been intercepted by Alexander's security systems. The message was clear: the Council is aware. Hammond has made his move. Alexander felt a surge of anger as he realized he had been betrayed once again, this time by someone he had trusted blindly. But he also knew there was no time to dwell on it. He had to act quickly if he wanted to survive. He ordered Hammond's immediate neutralization. He knew he couldn't let the traitor get away with it, and that every second that passed put him in greater danger. However, before they could act, Hammond had fled, disappearing without a trace. Hammond's escape was a devastating blow to Alexander's plans. He knew that now the Council had a significant advantage and that his next moves had to be carefully calculated. But he also knew that this betrayal would not go unpunished. Hammond may have escaped for now, but Alexander would do whatever it took to find him and make him pay. Hammond's betrayal and the revelation of the council as the true force behind the Black Hand led Alexander to a turning point. He knew he was on the brink of a final showdown, one that would determine not only his fate but the fate of the world as he knew it. With his resources limited and his enemies growing more powerful, Alexander decided to make one last desperate move. Using the information obtained by Marcus and Elena, he planned a direct attack on the council's finances. If he could cut off their access to money, he could weaken them enough to buy time and launch a counterattack. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed the support of those international leaders who also saw the council as a threat. He decided to convene a secret meeting with these leaders, offering them a temporary alliance to destroy their common enemies. The meeting took place in a secret location, a private island far from any surveillance. Alexander presented himself to the leaders with a mix of authority and humility, aware that he needed to earn their support if he wanted any chance of success. "We're facing a threat that goes beyond any of us," Alexander said firmly. "The council wants to reconfigure the world for their own benefit, and we're all on their list. If we don't unite now, there won't be anything left to save." There was a tense silence as the leaders considered his words. They knew what Alexander was saying was true, but they also knew that allying with him meant entering a war that could have unpredictable consequences. Finally, one of the leaders, a European president with a reputation for pragmatism, stood up. "I'm in," he said with determination. "We can't allow this threat to keep growing." One by one, the other leaders also joined the alliance. Alexander felt a wave of relief, knowing that he now had a real chance to confront the council. But he also knew that this war was far from over. The true showdown was yet to come, and he knew it would be the hardest battle of his life. The meeting ended with a clear plan: to strike at the council's finances in a coordinated manner, using every tool at their disposal. But just as Alexander began to feel the wind turning in his favor, he received a call that left him paralyzed. It was Greer, the man he had entrusted with his family's safety. His voice was grave, filled with a tension that Alexander had never heard before. "Alexander, we have a problem. We believe the council has discovered your family's location. We can't guarantee their safety for much longer." Alexander's heart sank. He had managed to form an alliance. He had prepared a plan to confront his enemies, but now his family, the most precious thing in his life, was in danger once again. Desperation began to take hold, but Alexander knew he couldn't afford to give in. He had to find a way to protect his family while pushing forward with his plans. He knew that the council was betting that he would crack under the pressure, but he also knew he couldn't let them win. The final move was in motion, and Alexander Wells was ready to risk it all. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Alexander Wells, the man who had built an empire and manipulated power in his favor for years, was standing at the edge of the abyss. The threat of the council, the organization behind the Black Hand, loomed over him with crushing intensity. His family, whom he had tried to protect at all costs, was in grave danger. Greer's call echoed in his mind, like a constant alarm that he couldn't ignore. He knew time was against him. He had formed an alliance with international leaders, neutralized his former head of security, Robert King, and uncovered the council's intentions. But all of that would be in vain if he couldn't ensure his family's safety and destroy the threat once and for all. Alexander contacted Greer immediately after receiving the call. Greer's voice, normally calm and controlled, was now tinged with worry. "We've moved your family to another safe house, but our sources indicate that the council has access to resources that could uncover their location within hours. We need a plan, Alexander, and we need it now." "I'm on my way," Alexander replied, his voice filled with determination. He hung up the phone and turned to his closest allies, Marcus Lee and Elena Vargas. "We need to act fast. I want you to keep the operation going. Keep the pressure on the council, but right now, my priority is my family. I need you to keep those bastards occupied while I handle this." Marcus nodded seriously. "Don't worry about us, Alexander. We'll make sure the council has plenty to worry about." Elena also showed her support. Greer is one of the best. If anyone can keep your family safe, it's him. But go and make sure there's no margin for error." Alexander didn't need anything more. He left the meeting quickly, his mind already in combat mode. As he made his way to where his family was hidden, he knew this would be the decisive moment. Everything he had done so far had been in preparation for this final confrontation. There would be no second chances. The journey to the new safe house was tense. Alexander was accompanied by a small security team, loyal to the last man. The location was an underground complex outside of New York, designed specifically for high-risk situations. Greer had chosen it for its inaccessibility and the defenses surrounding it. When Alexander arrived, he was greeted by Greer in person. "Everything's ready. We've reinforced security measures and are monitoring any suspicious activity within a 50-kilometer radius. So far, we haven't detected any immediate threats, but that could change at any moment." "Thank you, Sebastian," Alexander said as he moved into the complex. The cold, controlled atmosphere of the place reassured him momentarily, but he knew that calm could break at any moment. Finally, he reached the main room where his wife Sarah and their children were waiting for him. Seeing them, he felt a wave of relief, but also a growing anxiety. He had promised to protect them, but he knew that the only way to keep that promise was to eliminate the threat at its root. Sarah looked at him with evident concern in her eyes. "Alexander, what's going on? Why are we here? What are you hiding from us?" Alexander approached her, taking her hands in his. "Sarah, I'm doing everything I can to keep you safe. There are people who want to destroy us, but I promise I won't let that happen. I just need you to trust me a little longer." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I've always trusted you, Alexander, but please end this. Our children. We can't keep running." Alexander felt the weight of her words. He knew Sarah was right. This life of constant threats and dangers wasn't what he had promised his family, but he also knew he had no other choice. He could only move forward and finish what he had started. "I promise you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with contained emotion. "This will be over soon, but I need you to be strong, for them and for me." Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears. "I will, but I want you to remember that, no matter what happens, we're in this together." Alexander hugged his wife tightly, as if he could protect her from all the evil in the world with that gesture alone. He knew it wasn't so, but at that moment, he allowed himself the illusion. Then, he stepped away from her and went to his children, assuring them that everything would be all right. But he knew he couldn't stay long. There was work to be done, and he had to return to face the council. Before leaving, he turned to Greer. "Protect my family with your life, Sebastian. If anything happens to them, I'll never forgive myself." Greer nodded solemnly. "Don't worry about them, Alexander. I'll keep them safe. But you, go and finish this once and for all." Alexander left the safe house with renewed determination. He knew he couldn't fail. Not this time. As Alexander headed to the location of the final confrontation, his allies continued their assault on the council's finances and infrastructure. Marcus Lee and Elena Vargas were coordinating a massive cyber attack aimed at paralyzing the organization's bank accounts, blocking their resources and leaving their members without access to the capital needed for their operations. The attack was carried out on multiple fronts. Elena had reached out to former colleagues in the CIA and other international agencies, asking for help under the promise of exposing the secret network attempting to destabilize the world. This not only compromised the council, but also put several of its members under the scrutiny of intelligence agencies and law enforcement. The cyber attack was successful in many aspects. Several of the council's accounts were frozen, and some of its more visible members began to be investigated by authorities. However, Marcus and Elena knew this wouldn't be enough to stop such a powerful organization. They needed to go further, and the only way to do that was by fully exposing the council to the world. For that reason, while the cyber attack was underway, Alexander headed to the council's last stronghold, a place where he knew he could confront the organization's leaders face to face. This place was a fortress in the mountains, a highly protected complex that served as the council's secret headquarters. He had heard about this place through his contacts, but until now, hadn't had the opportunity to confirm its existence. Now, with the help of his allies, he had managed to trace the council's communications to this location, and he knew this would be the final confrontation. The fortress was guarded by a private army, composed of highly trained mercenaries. Alexander knew he couldn't face them alone, so he had summoned a special operations group that had worked with him in the past. These men and women, loyal to Alexander for the missions they had completed together, were willing to risk everything to help him destroy the council. When they arrived at the fortress, Alexander took a moment to survey the place. He knew what he was about to do was extremely dangerous, but there was no turning back. This was the moment of truth. "Ready?" he asked his team, receiving determined nods in response. No more words were needed. They knew what was at stake. The attack began quietly, with his team infiltrating the fortress using underground routes they had previously identified. The defenses were formidable, but Alexander had done his homework. He knew where the weaknesses were, and his team moved with surgical precision, eliminating guards and disabling alarms without being detected. Finally, they reached the heart of the fortress, where the council was gathered. Alexander knew there was little chance of getting out of this without facing brutal violence, but he also knew it had to be done. While his team secured the perimeters, Alexander entered the conference room where the council leaders were discussing recent events. When he burst into the room, he found 6 people sitting around a table, each with an expression of surprise and fury on their faces. But what truly shocked Alexander was seeing Elliot Marston, his former mentor, sitting at the head of the table. Well, Alexander," Marston said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't expect you to get this far. I thought you had learned to play this game more subtly." "And I thought you were dead, Elliot," Alexander replied, his voice icy. "But I see you were always good at pretending." Marston slowly stood up from his seat, keeping his hands visible. "You have no idea what's really happening here, do you? Everything you've done, every move you've made, has only been part of a much larger plan." "Enlighten me," Alexander said, keeping his weapon steady. "From the beginning, the council has been watching you. When you stepped away from my path, when you thought you had left that dark world behind, they knew you would eventually be a threat. But they also knew you could be useful. Every decision you made, every move you made to build your empire, was monitored, guided. You're a pawn, Alexander. You always have been." Alexander felt the anger burn inside him, but he didn't let it consume him. He knew Marston was trying to destabilize him, to make him commit a mistake. "If you think I'm going to let you keep playing with my life, you're wrong," Alexander responded, his voice firm. "This ends here." Marston raised his hands, a gesture of false submission. "Ends here? Alexander, you can't simply dismantle the council. You can't stop what we've started. The world needs a new order, and we're here to provide it. What you've done so far is admirable, but it's not enough." "And what is this new order?" Alexander asked, his finger on the trigger. "A world where real power isn't scattered among the weak and incompetent, but concentrated in the hands of those who know how to use it. A world where chaos is controlled by capable hands, and where people like you and me, Alexander, decide the fate of nations." "The only thing you've decided is your own death, Elliot," Alexander said before pulling the trigger. The shot echoed in the room, and Marston fell to the ground, his expression of surprise frozen on his face. The other members of the council tried to react, but Alexander and his team quickly neutralized them, giving them no chance to escape. The room fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing from Alexander and his men. He knew he had ended the leaders of the council, but he also knew the organization wouldn't collapse so easily. There were more members, more structures, but without their leadership, they would be much easier to dismantle. With the council decapitated, Alexander began dismantling the rest of the organization with the help of his international allies. Operations were carried out around the world, attacking the council's networks and destroying their resources. However, the victory didn't come without a cost. During the operations, Alexander lost several of his men, those who had loyally fought by his side. The price of this war was high, and Alexander knew he would always carry the weight of those losses. But finally, the threat was neutralized. The council's networks were destroyed, and their remaining members were arrested or eliminated. Alexander had achieved the impossible. He had dismantled an organization that aimed to restructure the world to its will. After the final operation, Alexander returned to the safe house where his family was. When he entered, Sarah ran to him, hugging him tightly. "Thank God, you're safe," she whispered, relieved. Alexander hugged her back with equal intensity, feeling a relief he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew the war was over, but he also knew his life would never be the same. "It's over, Sarah," he finally said, his voice filled with exhaustion. "I did it. I stopped them." Sarah pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes. "But at what cost, Alexander? At what cost?" Alexander didn't have an easy answer. He knew the price had been high, and that the scars from this battle would stay with him forever. He had won the war, but he had lost part of himself in the process. Over time, Alexander began to rebuild his life. He knew he could never go back to the life he had led before the council, but he also knew he had learned valuable lessons from this experience. He sold much of his empire, getting rid of the parts that reminded him too much of the person he had been. He used the remaining resources to fund charitable organizations, supporting causes that really mattered, like education and fighting poverty. He knew he couldn't erase his past, but he could try to make up for the damage he had caused. His family also benefited from this change. Alexander became more present in their lives, spending time with his children and strengthening his relationship with Sarah. Although the emotional scars of what they had lived through wouldn't easily fade, they knew they could move forward together. In his moments of reflection, Alexander thought about Elliot Marston, the council, and all those he had lost in the battle. He knew there would always be forces in the world trying to control and manipulate others, but he also knew there were people willing to fight against that oppression. One day, while walking through the grounds of his new home, Alexander looked out at the horizon, allowing himself a moment of peace. He knew he could never fully escape his past, but he also knew he had achieved something important. He had protected his family, defeated his enemies, and found a new purpose. Power, he had learned, was a dangerous tool, and those who possessed it had to wield it carefully. He had paid a high price for his ambition, but now, finally, he was at peace with what he had achieved and what he had lost. Months after the council's defeat, Alexander Wells received a letter. There was no return address, just a white envelope with his name written by hand. With some apprehension, he opened the letter and read the few words it contained. "The game never ends." Alexander smiled slightly, folding the letter and putting it in his pocket. He knew there would always be new threats, new enemies who would try to bring him down. But he also knew he was prepared. He had learned, he had grown, and now he understood that true power didn't lie in control, but in the ability to protect those he loved and fight for what was right. The game could continue, but Alexander Wells was ready to face it, no matter what came next. And with that certainty, he walked away, ready to begin a new chapter in his life, with the conviction that, no matter what happens, he would keep moving forward. Thank you for joining Alexander Wells on this intense journey. Did you feel moved by Alexander's struggle to protect his family and confront the council? If you were on the edge of your seat with every unexpected twist, don't leave without subscribing. Subscribe now to never miss one of our thrilling stories that explore the cost of power, redemption, and tough decisions. We want to hear from you. What do you think about the choices Alexander made? Would you have done the same in his place? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts with our community. Your opinion matters. And before you go, why not give the next story waiting on your screen a chance? We promise more action, more emotion, and more dilemmas that will make you question everything. Click now and dive into a new world full of intrigue.